All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're all about ideas here. The thinkers, the texts, the stuff that makes philosophy tick. And especially for you, our listeners out there, I mean, you're already deep in the philosophy, and today we're going even deeper. We're looking at how even the most foundational texts, the ones we all wrestle with, get reinterpreted over time, centuries even.
Yeah, spot on. For philosophers, it's not just about knowing the history, right? It's about grasping how philosophical inquiry works, how ideas get challenged, how they evolve. It all happens through that lens of thinkers coming after.
Exactly. And today's deep dive, well, it's Aristotle. Specifically, the whole history of commentary on his works. We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on commentators on Aristotle as our roadmap. And let me tell you, it's fascinating stuff, how one giant of thought gets understood, or sometimes misunderstood, over such a huge stretch of time.
What's really cool, especially for a philosopher like yourself, is seeing how different schools of thought, even individual thinkers, really grappled with Aristotle. We'll see those aha moments where they're clarifying, expanding, sometimes even refuting, and it reveals just how complex those writings really are.
So that's our mission today, to understand this whole tradition of commentary. Why did philosophers choose this way of engaging with Aristotle? What drove their interpretations? And ultimately, how did all this commentary shape how Aristotle's philosophy was received? We're hoping to shed some light on, philosophical dialogue itself, one philosopher reflecting on the work of another down through the ages. Okay, let's get into it. Where does this tradition of, meticulously commenting on texts even come from?
Well, it seems it really took off relatively late in the Hellenistic period, and it kept going strong through late antiquity. During that time, both Plato and Aristotle became major philosophical authorities, so naturally their works were studied intensely.
So we're not talking about casual notes in the margins, right? This is serious, focused engagement with figures at the very top of their field.
Exactly. And the crucial thing is, this commentary wasn't passive. Philosophers weren't just explaining or summarizing. They used commentary as a springboard for their own theorizing, using those established texts to develop their own perspectives.
That's a huge point. It wasn't just about figuring out what Aristotle meant, but about using his framework to push their own philosophical agendas. Maybe even in directions Aristotle himself didn't anticipate.
Precisely. And the source makes it clear when interest in Aristotle revived in the 1st century BCE, it wasn't blind acceptance of a fixed set of doctrines. They studied him rigorously, critically, because his work deserved it, not because they thought he was infallible.
So, no dogma here. They're actively grappling with a complex, influential body of work. And you mentioned the categories. Our source calls it central to this revival. Why this specific work? It's relatively short, and it's described as, well, difficult.
Well, what's interesting for us as philosophers is that the categories had been mostly ignored in the centuries before. Its comeback is linked to a wider effort in the 1st century BCE, basically, an editorial project. Thinkers like Apellicon of Teos, Turanian of Amisus, and of course Andronicus of Rhodes they were collecting, organizing, producing better editions of Aristotle's writings, making them more accessible. And Andronicus is often given credit for the first reliable edition of the categories.
Okay, so having a more authoritative text, that makes sense as a starting point, like finally getting a critical edition of something that had been scattered and fragmented before.
That's a good way to put it. But here's the thing, the revival wasn't just because of Andronicus. Interpretations of the categories were diverse from the start. It seems there were multiple independent lines of inquiry, all converging on this one text. This early branching out really shows how much multiplicity of meaning you can find in a rich philosophical work.
So even with a standard text, you immediately see different interpretations popping up. Now, the source mentions some of these ancient interpreters, Andronicus, Boethus, Athenodorus, Ariston, and Eudorus, all from the 1st century BCE. What were their approaches like?
It looks like Boethus of Sidon was the most likely to have actually written a formal commentary on the categories. Simplicius, a later commentator, described it as a word-by-word exegesis, so very meticulous, focused on individual words and phrases. In contrast, Andronicus apparently paraphrased the categories. Maybe he was more about the overall arguments and what he saw as Aristotle's intended meaning. These two ways of doing it, close textual analysis versus broader summary, those are enduring approaches to philosophical interpretation.
Word by word versus big picture argument. We still see that in scholarship today. What about Boethus specifically? What were his concerns?
Here's something relevant to the philosophical debates at the time. Boethus engaged directly with Stoic criticisms of the categories. See, The Stoics were very focused on language when it came to logic, and they saw Aristotle's categories, with its emphasis on, ontological categories, as lacking. Boethus defended Aristotle, pushing back against that purely linguistic view. He anticipated later readings that would highlight the metaphysical and logical importance of the work beyond just classifying language. This early defense shows how philosophers have always had to articulate and defend what their inquiries are even about.
So from the get-go, there's debate about what the category is even for. And it wasn't just those who liked Aristotle who were chiming in. Athenodorus, for instance, wrote against Aristotle's categories.
Right. This is more direct criticism. Athenodorus, he might have been a big deal in Roman politics. He wasn't writing a scholarly commentary like Boethus. Instead, he probably presented a series of objections, problems he found in the text itself, a more confrontational approach to analysis.
And it wasn't just external critics either. Even within the broader philosophical world, people outside the Peripatetic school, like Eudorus of Alexandria, he was an academic philosopher. He also found things to disagree with Aristotle about in the categories. Shows that this work went beyond any single school of thought. Absolutely. It became a focal point for discussion across different schools. Then you have Ariston of Alexandria. His case is a bit more mysterious. Seems he moved towards Peripatetic philosophy and wrote on the categories, but there's no evidence he knew about or was influenced by Andronicus or Boethus. So maybe there were independent lines of inquiry happening. Sounds like the early reception of the categories was a time of, parallel explorations. Different thinkers, different lenses, different agendas. The source mentions Michael Griffin's argument about Andronicus placing the categories at the start of his edition of Aristotle's works. How important was that?
Griffin makes a strong case that this editorial choice really boosted the prominence of the categories. Putting it first, especially for people new to Aristotle, basically made it the entry point into his whole body of thought. So Andronicus shaped how people would approach the text for centuries to come. Even if his own interpretation wasn't the most influential, the placement of the text amplified its impact.
It was almost like a pedagogical framing. Start here, with the categories. That's how you understand Aristotle. This early period really shows that engaging with a major philosopher isn't about just accepting a fixed doctrine. It's about actively interpreting, even debating, the most basic parts of their work.
Absolutely vital for any philosopher thinking about the history of their field. The categories drew in thinkers with all sorts of backgrounds and commitments, and that led to interpretations that weren't always what Aristotle himself intended. This openness to interpretation is what makes a philosophical text truly enduring.
Okay, so the first century BCE was a busy time for wrestling with Aristotle, especially the categories. How did this commentary tradition evolve after that?
Well, interpreting Aristotle kept going strong in the 1st and 2nd century CE. New figures came on the scene: Alexander of Ages, Soporition, Achaeus. They all had their own takes on the categories. We don't know a ton about their specific interpretations, but they show the continuing interest in the work. Then you start to see more pedagogical commentaries, like those by Adrastus of Aphrodisias and Aspasius. These were meant for teaching. Galen even mentions them as basic texts for students just starting to study the categories. So you see philosophy education becoming more formalized.
Commentary is now part of the curriculum. There's institutional support for studying these texts. And it's interesting, these commentaries by Adrastus and Aspasius, they even influenced later thinkers like Plotinus. Shows how ideas get carried forward across different schools.
Exactly. The commentary tradition is becoming more consolidated, more established. And another big development was imperial patronage of philosophy in Athens, starting with Marcus Aurelius setting up chairs of philosophy. This led to public teachers of Aristotelian philosophy like Alexander of Damascus, and later the very influential Alexander of Aphrodisias.
Yeah, Alexander of Aphrodisias. He's often seen as the authority on Aristotle. His work was all about presenting a clear, definitive understanding.
That's right. Alexander was committed to what he saw as Aristotle's true, authentic thought. He wanted to clarify and promote that, like in his treatise De Anima. It's not a line-by-line commentary, but it's deeply engaged with and explaining Aristotle's psychology. He saw himself as faithfully representing Aristotle's whole philosophical system.
And he wrote commentaries on a whole bunch of Aristotle's works. Many of them became super influential themselves.
Yeah, we still have his commentaries on the prior analytics, the topics, meteorology, on sense and sense objects. His commentary on the categories itself is mostly lost, but his other writings, plus his collections like Problems and Solutions and the Mantissa, they show us all the different methods he used. His big goal was to systematize Aristotle, extract his genuine thought, which is why he's known as the most authentic interpreter.
But the source points out a shift in later commentators. It wasn't just about understanding Aristotle on his own anymore.
You're right. Later commentators, especially in late antiquity, while they were definitely building on Alexander's work, they really prioritized finding agreement between Plato and Aristotle. This harmonization project became central to their interpretations.
The big reconciliation project, bringing those two giants of Greek philosophy together. And even in this new context, the categories remained important.
Absolutely. In late antiquity, most commentators were Platonists. They saw Aristotle as basically in line with Plato, maybe even as a stepping stone to Plato's philosophy. But even with this Platonic lens, the Categories was still seen as a crucial introductory text, so there was a new wave of commentary dedicated to it.
Enter Porphyry. He wrote not one, but two commentaries on the categories.
Mhm.
Clearly, it's still a core text in the curriculum.
Right. Porphyry wrote a massive 7-book commentary for a student named Gedalius, addressing all the problems and criticisms raised against the Categories. He also wrote a shorter one, in dialogue form, showing he understood that students at different levels need different approaches. And then there's his Isagoge, short but hugely influential intro to Aristotle's theory of predication. This became a must-read, coming before studying the Categories itself.
So now there's a pedagogical pathway. You start with Porphyry's Isagoge to get the basic concepts, then you move on to the categories, then to more detailed commentaries. Philosophical education is getting more structured.
Exactly. And Porphyry set a trend. Iamblichus, for example, wrote his own big commentary on the Categories. He drew a lot from Porphyry, but he also threw in what he thought were ancient Pythagorean writings, trying to show that Aristotle and other traditions were basically in harmony. This shows the growing tendency to blend different philosophical streams.
Wow, even using texts that might be forged, all for the sake of philosophical synthesis. Shows how strong this harmonizing impulse was. And Iamblichus' student, Dexippus, kept it going. He wrote a short summary of solutions to the criticisms of the categories, mostly based on Porphyry and Iamblichus.
Yeah, Dexippus used a simple question and answer format, making it even easier for beginners. By this point, the curriculum is set. You master Aristotle, starting with his logical works before moving on to Plato. And the Categories is firmly the first logical text you tackle.
And we have tons of other commentators from this era, Ammonius, Olympiodorus, Elias, Philoponus, all contributing commentaries or lecture notes on the categories. It's a canonical text now.
Totally. And this culminates in Simplicius, a very learned Platonist who deliberately tried to synthesize all the different interpretations that have built up. His commentary on the Categories is the most comprehensive we have from antiquity. He wanted to show that Plato and Aristotle were fundamentally in agreement. Simplicius represents the peak of this harmonizing trend.
But even after centuries of study and interpretation, the categories remained, as the source puts it, elusive. There were still debates about basic things. Its title, its place in Aristotle's work. The fact that different commentators preferred different titles tells us something about how they understood the work.
That's important. And even within Aristotle's logical works, there were disagreements. For example, Andronicus thought the Post-Predicamenta was a later addition to the Categories, maybe not even by Aristotle. But Adrastus argued that it was fundamentally connected to the topics. These ongoing disputes show just how hard it is to definitively interpret complex philosophical texts, even ones that seem foundational.
So figuring out Aristotle was never a simple task. The text brings up the commentary tradition on De Anima and the debates about the active intellect as another example of these complexities.
Yeah, that super famous, super difficult passage in De Anima 3.5 about the separate, impassible, unmixed intellect, it caused a lot of debate very early on. Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor at the Lyceum, was already puzzled by what this active intellect actually was. Was it part of us, or was it separate, even divine? This early uncertainty set the stage for centuries of different interpretations.
And later commentators came to very different conclusions. Alexander of Aphrodisias famously interpreted the active intellect as something outside the human soul, even identifying it with God or the first cause.
Right. For Alexander, the active intellect wasn't just our ability to think. It was this transcendent, divine principle that made the whole cosmos intelligible. It acted on our intellect, not from within.
But Themistius had a totally different view. He saw the active intellect as essential to being human.
Yeah, for Themistius, the active intellect was our rational capacity, what makes us human. He also thought it was a single intellect shared by all of us, separate from the passive intellect that's part of our individual souls. But for him, it was much closer to us than in Alexander's view. This huge contrast between two influential commentators really shows how difficult it can be to interpret even seemingly precise philosophical language.
So the Greek commentary tradition was this vibrant, multifaceted thing dealing with translation, interpretation, and this urge to synthesize different philosophies. What about the Latin tradition? How do they engage with Aristotle?
The Latin tradition started around the 4th century CE, and they had the extra challenge of translating from Greek. Marius Victorinus translated key logical works, including the Categories and Porphyry's Isagoge. He even wrote a commentary on the Categories, but sadly it's lost.
So they're not just grappling with the ideas, they're doing the essential work of making these texts accessible to a whole new audience.
Absolutely. But the key figure for bringing Aristotelian logic to the early Middle Ages in the Latin West was Boethius. Like many in late antiquity, he believed that Plato and Aristotle were fundamentally in agreement. He started this huge project of translating and commenting on both of their entire works, hoping to show their unity. He died before finishing, though.
But what he did accomplish had a huge impact. His translations and commentaries shaped medieval intellectual history in a major way.
For sure. Boethius translated the Categories, De Interpretatione, the Analytics, the Topics, the Sophistical Refutations, and Porphyry's Isagoge. He wrote both short, introductory commentaries and longer, more advanced ones. He was clearly very invested in teaching. He wrote his own commentary on the Categories and planned a more in-depth one, but it's not clear if he finished it.
And engagement with these texts continued in the Latin West through glosses, those marginal notes that were everywhere in medieval scholarship. So looking back at all this engagement with Aristotle, what are the big takeaways about the practice of commentary itself?
The source points out that there wasn't one single philosophy of the commentators. It was more like a shared practice. They all agreed that Aristotle was a major authority worth deep study. Even though they didn't have access to all his works at first, and commentary became the main way of engaging with him, there were always multiple interpretations. Different commentators had different priorities, whether it was defending Aristotle, harmonizing him with Plato, or using his texts to build their own ideas.
So it wasn't about finding one fixed truth in Aristotle, but about this ongoing effort to understand, interpret, and build on his work. It shows just how rich and open to new readings these foundational texts are.
Exactly. All this work by the commentators shows us that even texts we consider foundational are always open to new perspectives and reinterpretations.
So for you, our listener, you're a philosopher. This history of commentary on Aristotle shows you the core of philosophical inquiry. It's all about questioning, reinterpreting, engaging in dialogue, and that continues across time. Understanding this history helps us see the complexity of these texts and how philosophical understanding keeps evolving.
Yeah. Each generation of thinkers came to Aristotle with their own questions, their own frameworks, their own goals. This reminds us that even our own readings are shaped by our historical and intellectual context.
And that brings us to our final thought for you to ponder. We've seen this huge variety in interpreting Aristotle, from close textual analysis to grand synthesis. What does this tell us about whether we can ever truly grasp what a philosopher really meant? And even more importantly, what does it say about the value of engaging with these texts across different contexts? How do your philosophical views connect with, or maybe clash with, the approaches of the commentators we've talked about today? This deep dive into history, we hope it sparks even deeper philosophical thinking for you. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.